Well, for more on the crisis in Sudan and its economic impact, I'm joined by William Lawrence, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University. Professor Lawrence specializes in North African history, politics, and culture. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here again.
So for people who aren't familiar with Sudan's situation, how did things get to this point?
Well, it started primarily as economic protests and dovetailed over the last several months into a political protest and a regime-changing protest. And of course, there was a bit of a coup on April 11th that the protesters might have seen as them having a revolution and forcing Bashir out of power, but the military basically forced him out of power since he became a liability. Some people said sort of lopping off the diseased limb from the body, and others said a coup by committee. And part of the problem right now is while the protesters are quite organized, and I would say more than say that protesters in Algeria, in terms of having a common set of objectives, the regime is not very organized, and it's sort of a group of different factions and armed groups, and some in the regime that are more sympathetic with the protesters, others that aren't, and so it's quite complex. And given that complexity, among others, it's not clear that there's going to be any resolution soon to the political impasse.
Now, you mentioned that this actually started off as an economic protest. What was going on in the economy then? And now when you have this crisis in Sudan, what is that now doing to the economy?
So food prices, energy prices, and pretty much prices across the board. And that caused a set of groups to organize to protest these increases, primarily a group called the Sudanese Professionals Association, who've been the backbone of the movement, and that they're the sort of core group among a larger number of groups that form the Declaration for Freedom and Change. And while their problems at the beginning were primarily economic and the protests were quite small, they quickly figured out that with this current regime in place, their problems were not going to be solved. Now, the Sudanese economy has been never that strong. Since 1955, they've had, I recently tabulated, 47 years of civil war. So you never really had the proper post-Civil War period to put an infrastructure in place to make the whole economy work. Sudan could be the breadbasket for all of the Horn of Africa. Sudan could be an amazing tourism hub, but Sudan has none of the sort of normal things that an economy can run on because of this long history of civil wars and conflict and chaos. And so when South Sudan split off, 3/4 of the oil revenues went with it. They do produce quite a bit of oil. 80% of the population works in agriculture, subsistence level agriculture for the most part. So there isn't much there. And now with the internet turned off, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of losses for the economy just on the lack of the internet functioning properly. So things don't look good right now.
And to that point, speaking of the blackout, obviously, the internet is the main way that protesters tend to mobilize. That's how they gather together. And then, of course, running businesses. On the ground, what is the situation like for people there?
Well, I think the protesters are now being organized by international phone calls and SMS. So the Sudanese diaspora is involved, and it's very complicated. And the organizers are saying, you know, when they would have had hundreds of thousands, you know, they might be getting hundreds or thousands instead because they simply can't get the word out. I think that's one of the reasons they decided on June 30th as a day everyone will come out. So that'll be interesting to see how many defy the recent violence against protesters and take a chance to come out and protest. In terms of business, this can't go on forever because a lot of Sudanese businesses rely on the internet. Certainly things like ride-sharing apps, like travel services. There are a lot of things that Sudanese have come to depend on that the internet plays a very important role for the way they even cash, you know, like in Africa, a lot of cash transfers are by telephone, by mobile. So if this can't go on forever, I don't think the regime will want it to go on forever. And this lawyer you mentioned, he's now suing so that all Sudanese can get the privileges that he alone now has. Because his lawsuit,
certainly hope so, because that would be quite selfish to be the only man in the country with internet. But speaking of people who are trying to make an effort to help, we know that Ethiopia is trying to negotiate. We know that there's also been question about the African Union's role in this. How do you see this playing out?
Well, first of all, the reason the African Union keeps coming up is because General Sisi is allied with UAE and Saudi Arabia, who are very much backing the Transitional Military Council, and they think Sisi can buy them time and buy them a certain amount of political space to, let's say, make less concessions to the crowd. But as soon as the Ethiopian proposition was put forward, and the TMC said, "Oh well, that's not coordinated with the AU," quickly a lot of people said, "Oh no, it's in full coordination, and this can be considered." So the Ethiopian mediation is the best mediation right now. The Americans are better and better organized. Assistant Secretary Nagy, the new envoy Booth, have been speaking out in favor of a number of positive moves on Sudan and trying to get the Europeans more organized. But I don't see any progress in the near future, primarily because of this $3 billion promise that the Emiratis, the Saudis, and made with the help of the Egyptians, which are putting the military people in charge in a position not to want to deal.
Certainly a lot to untangle there. Thank you so much for breaking that down for us. William Lawrence there, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University.